Hi, welcome back to Head of the Curve. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Teed. Today, we're going to be talking about scoliosis and genetic links with Dr. Mark Morningstar. He is a founding member of the Society of Scoliosis, Orthopedic and Rehabilitation Treatment, also known as SOSORT. He is an expert in non-surgical exercise-based scoliosis treatments, including ScoliSmart. Has been published over 60 times in biomedical peer-reviewed literature. And he's the host of Scoliosis World podcast, available on all the places you listen to podcasts. Welcome, Mark. Good to have you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Mark, I'd love to hear, in addition to all of your accolades, what got you interested in scoliosis to begin with?
Well, so I suppose it goes all the way back to even, I'm a chiropractor, obviously, by trade. So when I was in chiropractic school, one of the things that I always sort of gravitated towards was kind of like a hybrid approach to chiropractic or what we would call traditional chiropractic care, with a very big emphasis on adjustments or manipulation and combining that with a lot of active care, rehabilitation, or therapy. And so when I graduated, I opened my practice that way and ran a practice like that. But what was interesting is very early on, I sort of became frustrated, to be honest, because a lot of times when I would try to give people things to do at home to help their problem. A lot of people would come in with, issues that in a very general sense, I would consider them like self-inflicted. They're consequences of poor lifestyle habits or lifestyle choices. And if they weren't going to have any skin in the game, then why were they coming to see me? You know what I mean? And it's almost sort of like I had this ethical dilemma with it. It's like, why am I having this person continue to come back on a regular basis if they're not going to do what I ask at home? And, they're really not making any effort to try to change what got them to this point.
Mm-hmm.
However, over the course of that time, a lot of these people would, in my area, there's nobody really close as far as scoliosis surgeons goes. You have to go, an hour or so or more away. And so a lot of people, they would bring their kids in to see me because they just went to the pediatrician, just found out they have scoliosis, and they might have, a month or 6-week wait before they go see ortho. And so they wanted to see what we could do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what became very obvious right from the get-go is that although maybe mom and dad weren't doing what I was asking them to do at home, come hell or high water, they were going to make sure that their child does exactly what I have them do at home. And lo and behold, they start getting very consistent results, because they're doing the homework.
Mm-hmm.
And that became much more gratifying to me instantly. And it wasn't long after that. I mean, that was probably maybe 2004, 2005. And since then I switched everything over and I have had essentially a scoliosis dedicated practice since.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. I can relate to a lot of that. I have scoliosis myself, so I'm very
Okay.
in tune with you're diagnosed with it. Your curve isn't bad enough to do anything about it. So let's just kind of wait and see if it gets worse.
Sure.
Yeah.
As if doing nothing is considered a treatment strategy in 2025.
Unfortunately, I think that's still pretty much the case for a lot of docs. So,
True.
what made you delve into the world of research?
Well, again, for our profession in general, one of the biggest things that I always got hit over the head with, my wife is a physician, so I would go to a lot of her stuff as well. One of the big knocks has always been, well, there's not a lot of research to support what you're doing for XYZ. And sometimes that was or wasn't true, but especially with what I was getting into from a non-surgical scoliosis treatment mindset, you talk about swimming upstream from the sense of, scoliosis management. Here I am trying to show that what we're doing works, but nobody will listen to me because I have nothing to back it up empirically.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really became obvious from the beginning that, okay, if we're going to try to advance non-surgery scoliosis treatment, you obviously have to publish it because that's the only thing really pretty much anybody's going to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
And so from there, it was just, it took off from there.
That's great. Yeah. I see the importance of it, but it kind of makes my brain feel really confused
No,
to
that's fair.
study that aspect of care. So I
That
appreciate
definitely works.
I appreciate you what you do.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, I mean, it's, I started out small because again, from I'm a clinical researcher. It's not like I, teach at I'm on faculty at a college or somewhere, that kind of thing. So I'm not afforded that kind of grant opportunity and things like that. So, it started out small, individual case reports and things like that, just to get the hang of it. But once you do enough of them, it definitely gets easier because you can have templates for kinds of studies. And even in the research world now, they've made a lot of the templating easier to do, especially with, like some of the strobe criteria for various studies. It already pretty much outlines what you have to write. So that does make it easier in for people like me who don't really have a whole lot of external support. You're just kind of like, I'm trying to run this practice over here. And then at the same time, in my free time, I'm trying to do research when I can find the time with, I have a family, 4 kids, so, but I do like, I, I think I stay with it because I enjoy it. I could see entirely why people who are not big into research would get discouraged very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
So let's get into a little bit about one of the studies that you've done recently.
Yep.
So there's some different theories out there as to why adolescent idiopathic scoliosis occurs. Can you just kind of give us a little bit of a brief overview of that?
Sure, sure. Well, so I think if you really sort of put together all of the studies that have been out there, especially in the last, say, 15 to 20 years, what you really come to appreciate is that idiopathic scoliosis is a multifactorial condition. It's not just a biomechanical problem. It's not just a genetic problem. It's not just a hormonal problem. It's all of those. And the the point of looking at it that way is, so for example, when I'm showing a patient an x-ray of their back, and of course you see the curve on the x-ray, if everybody, and I mean, like, if I were to walk here into my local community and ask 100 people what scoliosis is, they're going to tell me it's that curve on the x-ray.
Mhm.
But that curve is not synonymous with the entire condition. That curve is only the musculoskeletal ramification of a whole series of things that predated it.
Mhm.
And a lot of those other pre-existing things or precursor things have genetic origins to them or have hormonal origins to them. And so I think when you look at that way, it's important because if all of those things fed into that curve developing during a time of rapid growth, it only makes sense to try to address those things at the time that you're also trying to address the curve. Otherwise, whatever physical treatment you're doing for the curve is going to have less of a chance of providing a lasting change.
Mhm.
And really, if in sort of keeping true with an entire chiropractic mindset of whole body health and everything works together, um, that if you're not treating the whole condition, you're really sort of doomed to fail.
Mhm. Yeah.
And now, I mean, I think in reality, everybody's a little bit different in the sense that, I kind of look at scoliosis as a pie graph. There's going to be a certain chunk of that pie graph that's devoted to genetic variants. There's going to be a certain chunk of it devoted to hormone imbalances or digestive disruptions and all these other things that we know commonly affect young kids who end up getting diagnosed with a curve. But there's no reason why we shouldn't be addressing all of those things at the same time.
Mhm. Yeah.
And when we start to look at, for example, it's been known for, gosh, back into the early 1980s, that melatonin problems exist in kids who develop scoliosis. Well, of course, that's an entire, you hear of melatonin, but you're really talking about an entire amino acid pathway where melatonin is just the end product. There
Mhm.
could be broken links that entire pathway that result in a problem with melatonin. And some of those links upstream, so to speak, are genetically based or genomically predisposed. And so if I'm trying to restore that melatonin issue or restore that entire pathway, I have to work on that pathway. And there might be ways genetically, for example, that will give me insight on how to best work on that pathway for that individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what are some of the genes that you look at that kind of have that trickle down effect?
Yeah, so like as an example, we run a genomic test in our office that actually looks at 28 total different genomic variants. And what's interesting is for a lot of people out there, a lot of people sort of mistakenly think of, okay, if I have a gene variant, um, it's going to cause scoliosis. And in fact, a lot of the early genetic studies in scoliosis were sort of looking at, okay, let's try to identify that one gene that causes scoliosis so that we can fix it. Well, it wasn't long before very quickly there are, 60, 70, 80 genes that purportedly all singularly cause scoliosis. And you come to understand, okay, how can all of that be true? Right? Now, of course, you're going to have some different variances for ethnic populations and things like that, but they can't all be singularly causing a curve. When the better interpretation really is that they all sort of can cross-sect and result in a curve. And we see that a lot clinically because we could have a child with scoliosis and we try to really be good about drilling down on family history of any potential curves. And there is no known history, but yet this child has a curve. Well, when we genetically test them, we can find that, okay, it looks like this child inherited groups of different gene variants, some from mom and some from dad, that all sort of cross-sected and resulted in the ability to have scoliosis during rapid growth. And it's also about, the way I explain this to patients is it's really about showing us what and I'm going to date myself a little bit using this analogy, but it's like looking at the scratches on your record, right? So like when the needle goes around that record and hits that scratch, it messes with the song that is playing. But if I keep that record waxed properly and fill in the scratches, then the song still plays as good as possible. But the problem is I can't fix the scratch permanently, so I have to keep regularly waxing the scratch to get the song to play right. Genomic variants are really much the same thing. There are different lifestyle, functional medicine kinds of strategies that we can employ to effectively wax that genomic variant, if you will, to make sure that it's minimizing any downstream impact on whatever physiology it governs.
Wow. That's really interesting. I've never heard it explained that way.
Yeah. Well, and as you know, and for a long time, because of course we've been studying this for a while, and a lot of times, you try to explain this to people and like, well, how can taking supplements or doing XYZ fix scoliosis? And what's hard to explain is that that's not the aim of taking the supplements. Now, having said that, though, what's interesting is there was a study published in Romania 2 summers ago, I believe, in a journal called Children, where they took a number of kids who were very newly diagnosed with scoliosis, curves in the teens as far as their Cobb angle goes, and divided them out into 2 groups. Half the kids, still kept just doing observation, watch and wait, do nothing. But the other half took literally only 3 nutrients. They took calcium, vitamin D, and melatonin. And in the kids who took those nutrients, their curves did not progress nearly at the same rate as the kids who did nothing.
Yeah.
So they're obviously impacting some of those scratches, if you will, to help make sure that they're not impacting as that child continues to grow.
Yeah. So can you explain, let's kind of switch gears a little bit. Can you explain COMT to me? What is that?
Yeah.
And what is
Yeah.
connection
Okay.
to
So
AM?
a couple of ones, obviously COMT and MTHFR, which I'm sure you'll ask me about as well. But COMT is an enzyme that does a couple of things. First off, it is one that chiefly helps in the process of estrogen metabolism. And as a secondary function, it's what also helps convert dopamine into norepinephrine and epinephrine downstream. All of those have impacts on scoliosis in different ways. So, of course, one of the big, very common commonly running themes throughout kids who are diagnosed with a curve is that they typically have a lower than average bone density than their peers. Not to a level of osteopenia or osteoporosis, anything like that, but typically on average, it is 1 to 1.5 standard deviations lower than their peers. And a full 1/3 of chilled teenagers with a curve qualify as being osteopenic.
Hmm.
So it is a common issue. Well, one of the big hormones responsible for developing bone growth and signaling bone lengthening, one of them is estrogen, and the other one's actually melatonin. And they're responsible for signaling bone lengthening and bone formation. So any problems with their metabolic pathways obviously makes it feasible that it could translate downstream into abnormal musculoskeletal growth, which is where then a curve starts to set in. And COMT is one of the big enzymes involved in the estrogen, specifically estradiol, the most active estrogen, in processing that down into the good waste products, if you will, of estrogen metabolism.
Okay. So how can somebody counter that effect? So just by taking a supplement or
Well,
what?
so there are certain ways. So, like as easy examples, we always try to tackle things from a nutrient, dietary, supplement, and lifestyle perspective, kind of all encompassing. Well, I think in today's, honestly, to borrow a phrase from RFK Jr., the toxic soup of a world we live in,
Mhm.
we are exposed to a lot of estrogen mimicking chemicals in our environment, whether it be from plastic water bottles, whether it be from the thermal receipts on a gas station pump, anything like that that has BPA or any similar estrogen mimicking compounds in them messes with our ability to process estrogen correctly. And they start to signal a lot of excess estrogen pathways to occur. So minimizing exposure to plastics and estrogen mimicking chemicals is a must. And frankly, that's good advice for anybody, honestly. But especially in kids with scoliosis, especially during the growing years, chiefly. I would say from a supplements perspective, one of the other things is to promote healthy estrogen metabolism into its byproducts. So if the COMT is not working, or if the ability to produce that enzyme is less, the goal becomes to try to give the body as many of the raw materials available from which to make that enzyme as possible. Essentially trying to lower the threshold and make it as easy as we can to make that enzyme given the genetic predisposition. So really any kind of methyl donor is an important precursor to help with COMT production. Also, from a dietary perspective, a lot of the cruciferous vegetable family is important at providing a lot of that enzyme's activity or precursor materials, like glucoraphanin and some of the stuff like that in the cruciferous vegetables. And then a couple of the B vitamins, namely vitamin B6 is very powerful in the COMT production cascade, and B12 to a lesser extent. So B vitamin status is also very important because of their enzyme functions.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Then what about MTHFR?
MTHFR, if there's a genetic variant out there that most people have heard of, this is probably the one. And if you go online, there are all kinds of resources that discuss MTHFR. In fact, there's an entire website devoted to literally just MTHFR and all the research published on it, not even just in scoliosis, but a host of other issues. But what's interesting is MTHFR is also an enzyme similar to COMT, but it has a couple of different downstream effects. First and foremost, it's what helps your body activate vitamin B9, or what we know as folic acid. The problem is folic acid, whether it be in a dietary form or in a supplement form, folic acid as the ingredient folic acid is a synthetic material. Your body has to activate that, or by methylation. Well, if you have reduced MTHFR enzyme activity, it makes it harder to convert that folic acid. In fact, years ago, I think it was in the late 80s, I want to say, there was an article in Prevention magazine called "Is Your Breakfast Cereal Killing You?" And the whole concept was that in people who are MTHFR positive, if they were to consume, because a lot of breakfast cereals are fortified with synthetic folic acid. And what they were finding is that people who have this MTHFR gene variant, they were actually more likely to develop colorectal cancer because this folic acid, at least in the model, was getting deposited in the large intestine because the body can't do anything with it. And then just sort of causing a chronic inflammatory reaction because it's a foreign entity. And so people with MTHFR do have and very highly established elevated cancer risks like colorectal cancer because of that gene variant. So a lot of people outside of the scoliosis topic have heard of that enzyme for a lot of other significant and perhaps sometimes more serious reasons. But what's interesting in scoliosis is we published a preliminary study showing that, statistically speaking, about 1 out of 5 Caucasians have the MTHFR variant or gene variant. But in the case of idiopathic scoliosis, it's about half. So it pops up much more routinely as compared to the general population. And that can't be a coincidence. And so, that just kind of led to a lot of, and we found similar ratios in COMT and how much it popped up in the general population and much more frequently than in the adolescent idiopathic scoliosis population. And again, it just gets your gears turning. It's kind of like, all right, this obviously is not a coincidence. How are these things impacting, this curve presentation? And more importantly, the progression of it going through. And that's where the crux of our study done that I did with Jessica. That's the crux of that study, is to evaluate not just do these genes, are they responsible for the onset, but how do they impact progression?
Yeah, and that's so important and so interesting. How did your team go about researching these 2 genes, and what did that look like?
Well, so and I practice, my primary office is an integrative medicine practice. So it was an easy thing for me to obtain in all of my patients. And what really was happening was, I'm going along in my practice career and Jessica's kind of going along in a parallel direction until at some point our paths converge. And she found a bunch of research and contacted me and said, hey, look, if you have data, I would love to kind of run it with what we're seeing. And they were looking at a little bit more of MTHFR and COMT and how those variants impact different types of prescription drug metabolism, which a lot of people do use genomics for. But obviously she was finding it very interesting in the correlations to scoliosis. So she contacted me one day several months ago and said, hey, look, I think this will be a fantastic collaboration, and away it went.
Amazing. So
Yeah.
what did your actual process look like for conducting this research?
Well, for that study, it was very easy. So because all the patient data had already been done in our office, in my office. And so I literally just had to hand over the data. They kind of ran it all through the statistical analysis, and then, it spit out the answers from there. So, and they had a few patients on their own, but it was there, 97 patients from our office and 5 patients from that she was able to obtain. So a little over 100 patients in total. But the results were very, very eye-opening. And I had never thought to look at it, which was nice to, kind of bring somebody from the outside looking in, kind of get a fresh pair of eyes on it, is she was able to kind of look at, okay, I'm looking at these 2 genes in particular, whereas all along I've been kind of going back through and looking at 28 of them, MTHFR and COMT being but 2 of those 28. And so she picked those out, and lo and behold, when, obviously people have those 2 variants at the same time, their curves were far more likely to get worse substantially than people who either had neither of the 2 or just one or the other.
Interesting.
So it was very interesting.
So, what were the progression rates for the people who progressed?
Well, so what we did for the study is just to kind of look at, okay, when we take a child who is newly diagnosed, and of course they already have things out there like the progression factor, and these are really sort of all calculations based on what is the person's age at diagnosis, what is their riser score, meaning their growth plate maturity at the time of diagnosis, and what's their chronological age and curve measurement at the time of diagnosis. And they take all those things in and basically into a formula that spits out what they call a progression factor, which means based on these metrics, your curve has X% chance of progressing, classically defined as increasing 6 degrees or more. Well, what we did for the study is to say, okay, we're defining progression, because other authors have done this similarly, is to say, okay, what is the number of kids whose curves progress 20 degrees or more from the time of initial diagnosis, either to the time of surgery or to the time that they're done growing. And the kids who had both gene variants hit that 20-degree progression rate far more often than the kids who, like I said, had neither or one or the other.
Wow, interesting. So, what questions remain unanswered after all this research?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, we really only looked at those two relative to progression. And so it makes me sort of go back and wonder, okay, out of these other 28 that we've been looking at, how do any of the other ones also have a factor in curve progression or not? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And also, more importantly, I think even just aside from progression, is there a mechanism by which the MTHFR and the COMT gene variants taken, in people who have both of them, if you can identify those things in a child early enough that they don't yet have a curve, but they have all of these gene variants that make it look like they could develop a curve, is doing something from a functional medicine perspective, putting them on methylfolate or, cruciferous vegetables, the things that help with this enzyme activity. Does doing those things actually change the natural course of the development of the curve?
Yeah.
And really, that's sort of kind of like the pot at the end of the rainbow, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So, and then being able to kind of put all of these genomic variants into a very, we already have a test that we use, like I said, for the 28 genes, but then it becomes not just about showing all the variants that each person who's already been diagnosed with a curve has. It's about, can this test be reliably used to predict an oncoming curve? And then if so, does the treatment actually alter the course of natural history, which are the two yet to be determined answers.
Yeah, yeah. I'd be curious also to see it translate to older adults as well, because as you know, curves don't stop progressing once you
Right.
finish going.
Right.
So,
Yep, for sure. For sure.
yeah.
Yep. And I mean, there's a reason why, even you just look at statistical prevalence, right? So you take children ages 10 to 13, and it's about 2 to 3% of them, depending on the author you read. If I fast forward then to adult childbearing age women, it's about 15 to 20%. Then I fast forward to postmenopausal women 60 and up, and it's 2 out of 3. Well, when you're looking at just a curve in a kind of a 10,000 foot overview, what are the commonalities between puberty, pregnancy, and perimenopause? Are periods of rapid hormone change. Well, lo and behold, a lot of the genetic variants that we're looking at govern different aspects of various hormone metabolism pathways. So again, not a coincidence. It's just figuring out how to best incorporate all of that information into what you're doing from a physical treatment perspective. Because scoliosis in general, in today's day and age, no matter where you're at in the world, is still pretty much spearheaded by an orthopedic surgeon, from the conventional model, right? Well, an orthopedic surgeon is not going to care what your progesterone looks like. They're not going to care what your dopamine looks like or your serotonin or all these things, because that's not what they do. They're only trying to treat the curve. Well, the problem is the curve is the symptom of the problem. The curve is not the problem. And so it really sort of takes kind of a hybrid approach to deal with scoliosis effectively. You can't just sort of be a clinic that kind of dabbles in scoliosis treatment, because you're not going to do all the other non-physical treatment components. You really do, in my opinion at least, need to be a scoliosis dedicated practice to be able to handle the condition in its entirety.
Yeah. So in a perfect world,
Yeah,
what would it look like for you to see scoliosis care improve? Like
sure.
just from get-go for adolescents and then for an adult who,
Sure. Well, heck, if we're talking about a perfect world,
yeah,
I would say,
I want to hear
yeah,
it.
yeah. Well, I think first, so let's assume, because at some point in a generation, you're going to have to know that there's a family history established already. So let's assume, for sake of example, mom knows that she has a curve.
Mhm.
So now daughter's born or son is born, and that child is maybe 4, 5, 6 years old. Whatever we need to do to get a cheek swab to run a DNA profile to identify those genetic variants, and then we figure out, okay, this child does have the gene variants that puts him or her at risk for developing an idiopathic curve. Right then and there, 4, 5, 6 years old, we're going to do all of those functional medicine strategies to mitigate the impacts of all of the gene variants that they have individually, because
Mhm.
not everybody necessarily is the same. Um, and if we can then do that, even if we, for example, could reduce the incidence of scoliosis by half, we've now done a very tremendous thing for humankind.
Yeah. I mean that I don't know why. I mean, like that's making me like get a little bit emotional because I as a woman, it's a fear for a lot of us that our
Sure,
child is
sure.
going to develop scoliosis to hear that there's something preventatively that can be done to, do all that you can do to prevent them from getting it is just like, yeah.
Right, right, absolutely. I mean,
Uh,
most people, there's nothing they wouldn't do for their child,
right.
understandably. So, I mean, but the
Yeah.
problem is they're not normally given this information. And that's the
No.
hard part.
Mhm. Yeah. And then as an adult who is stepping in and finding out this information, what would a perfect treatment plan look like for them? So obviously, like getting the genetic testing, but
Sure,
then you're kind of
sure.
similar
Well,
treatment.
what's very interesting in adult patients is, obviously they had a curve, they've had a lifelong history of a curve, or at least most of their life of a curve. And so a lot of times they're coming in later on because something happened. And usually it's my curve was, say, 25 degrees when I was 17. And the
Mhm.
doctors at the time said, well, you're skeleton mature. I'm not going to do anything about it. Have a nice life. Just be active. Well, lo and behold, life happens. And now a 25-degree curve over the course of time becomes a 40-degree curve. And obviously, the older we get, our muscle density naturally decreases a little bit as well. So our ability to actively support the curve at the same time that the curve is slowly worsening, our muscle support around it is gradually weakening over time, just because we're aging. And there hits some critical mass where now the curve, the leverage caused by the curve, exceeds what we're doing in terms of that person's natural active stability to maintain it.
Mhm.
And so in a lot of adult patients, I'm looking at, okay, how can I help with their bone density? Because a lot of times, again, around perimenopause, bone density starts to decline from the hormone changes associated with menopause. So that is one component that we also have to address properly. And in doing so, we're at least making an attempt to arrest any continuing ongoing curve progression that we might have. Because again, if I'm only treating the curve in an adult and I'm ignoring all of these other risk factors, I'm not going to be able to get the lasting response that I'm looking for. I might be able to get a temporary one, but I don't want just a temporary response. I want that person to get a curve improvement and pain relief and improvement in postural aesthetics. I want to get all of these things, and I want them all to last, ad infinitum.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that is to address all of the things that could be feeding into that curve worsening over time. So of course you have to work on muscle strength and active stability, but you also have to work on stopping or reversing some of that bone density loss they might have had from perimenopause, which in some cases, in my office, like I mentioned, I'm an integrative medicine practice. Sometimes that includes things in an adult patient like bioidentical hormone replacement or other stuff that, our medical director would oversee. But at that point, again, now you're treating the entire problem, not just the curve on the x-ray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So important.
Absolutely.
That's really, really, that's good information in the care that I do. I'm always referring out for that aspect of bioidenticals and
Sure.
yeah.
Sure. And that's the same, I know a lot of, especially chiropractors here in Michigan that I work with and refer a lot of patients for scoliosis care. They kind of look at that as well. So, well, you should be on bioidenticals or you should be on XYZ, but either I can't do that or I don't do that in my practice. So go see Morningstar so he can kind of help at least get you going in the right direction.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So anything else? Any closing thoughts that we didn't cover, or like what is your hope for?
Well, my hope for the future is, like I said, that at some point there gets to be, and here's the problem with medicine in general, and you can lump alternative medicine into this as well, and I don't know who first said this, again, I'm stealing this from somebody, I'm sure, but I don't think medicine really changes. I think what happens is the general public gets enough awareness about something that ultimately, when enough people know about it and you sort of hit that critical threshold, and even amongst providers, whether it be chiropractors or orthopedic surgeons or whoever else, they don't necessarily update what they're doing. It's just the older generation and the way they were doing things dies off or retires from practice, and the new generation comes up and just learns a brand new way of doing things, and they accept the way they're doing it as self-evident.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in a lot of cases, which is one of the interesting things with research, even though everybody wants it, you'll find all kinds of papers in PubMed that say that, yes, all this research is out here. How come clinicians aren't applying this research into their clinical practice decision-making? Well, it's because you can't teach an old dog new tricks to a certain extent. So I just want the information to get out there. And I think when enough parents get a hold of this information and start demanding this kind of testing and demanding this kind of management from their provider, whomever that is, then the providers will have to get on board. Otherwise, they will risk losing their patient base.
Yeah.
And it's just as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very important. Thank you for coming on and sharing.
That was great. I appreciate it.
It was really enlightening, and yeah, I think it's just the more people that get a hold of this, the better. And
sure.
I like to finish up my podcast with asking a question. What are you doing in your life right now to stay ahead of the curve?
What am I doing to stay ahead of the curve? I try to live by a do as I do and not as I say. If I'm going to give people things to do at home, homework wise, to not only work on their curve but help prevent curve and maintain long-term improvements, I probably need to be doing the things that I'm doing on my own as well for my own back. It's like physician heal thyself, right? So I can't honestly look at a patient and tell them do XYZ when I'm not doing my own XYZ. So
yeah. Great. Well, thanks again for coming on. It was a pleasure having you.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Until next time, stay well and stay ahead of the curve.